At 37, Hannah Cain thought she'd seen the worst her father could do, until he dragged her into the crowded marketplace and sold her like cattle. Humiliation burned hotter than the midday sun as strangers stared, whispered, judged. Her buyer, Elias Crow, was a mountain recluse with eyes like winter stone and secrets buried deeper than the snow on his peaks. She expected cruelty. Instead, she found a locked chest, a wounded hawk, and whispers of a past that tied her fate to his. But when her father returned with the law in his pocket, Hannah's fight for freedom had only just begun. The sun beat down on the dusty heart of Dry Creek as the Saturday market swelled with voices and bartering. Hannah Cain had walked those streets for decades, head held high, doing her best to ignore the whispers about her failed marriage and dwindling fortunes. But today was different. Today, her father's hand clamped around her arm like a manacle, dragging her through the crowd with a purpose that churned her stomach. Robert Cain was a man people didn't dare cross, not because he was noble, but because he had a talent for ruining those who defied him. His debts had mounted over years of gambling and bad deals, but Hannah had never imagined he'd make her the currency to settle them. They reached the open square where traders hawked goods from wooden stalls. The smell of leather, spices, and livestock filled the air. Without ceremony, Robert shoved her up onto the flatbed of an empty wagon. The crowd noticed. Conversations paused. Heads turned. "Listen up!" Robert's voice cut through the hum like a whip crack. "Got myself a fine, strong woman here, 37, still fit enough for work, and I'm willing to let her go for the right trade." He gestured at her with mock pride, like she was a prize mare on auction. "Owe me a debt? Got a decent hunting rifle? Maybe a few sacks of flour? She's yours." Laughter rippled through the market. Someone muttered, "Guess the old man's really lost it." Another voice said, "What did she do to deserve that?" Hannah kept her gaze fixed on the scuffed boards beneath her feet. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Her pulse thudded in her ears, drowning out the murmur of speculation. "Come now," Robert goaded, scanning the crowd. "Any takers? She's past her prime for beauty, but she can work. And she won't give you lip if you keep her busy." A few men shook their heads, uneasy. Most just watched with morbid curiosity. Then a low voice cut through the stillness. "I'll take her." The speaker stood near the edge of the crowd, tall and broad-shouldered, his hair threaded with silver. Elias Crow was a name everyone in Dry Creek knew but few spoke to. He lived high in the mountains, coming down only for supplies. The stories about him varied: hermit, trapper, ex-soldier, but all agreed on one thing he kept to himself. Robert's brows lifted in surprise. "Crow, is it? Didn't figure you'd be in the market for company. I said I'll take her." Elias's tone was even, his face unreadable. He stepped forward, carrying a well-kept Winchester rifle in one hand. "And I'll throw in 3 sacks of flour from my wagon." The transaction was quick, almost businesslike. Robert's fingers released Hannah's arm, leaving pale marks on her skin. He took the rifle, inspected it like it was made of gold, and slung it over his shoulder. "Pleasure doing business," he said with a smirk, not sparing his daughter another glance. Hannah stood frozen, feeling the eyes of the market on her. The humiliation was a living thing, hot and suffocating. She'd been stripped of her dignity in less than 5 minutes. Elias didn't touch her. He simply nodded toward the road leading out of town. "Come on." His voice held no warmth, but neither did it carry malice. She followed him to a sturdy wagon piled with supplies, sacks of grain, barrels of kerosene, bundles of tools. He helped her up onto the wooden seat, then reached into a side pouch and pulled out a folded wool blanket. "Might get cold," he said, placing it beside her. From another bag, he took half a loaf of bread. "Eat if you're hungry." The gesture was unexpected, and for a moment Hannah didn't know how to respond. She clutched the bread and blanket like anchors in a storm, even as she stared straight ahead. Elias climbed onto the seat beside her, took the reins, and with a gentle click of his tongue, the horses started forward. The market noise faded behind them, replaced by the creak of wheels and the rhythmic clop of hooves. Hannah didn't look back. There was nothing left for her in Dry Creek except the memory of her father's voice, loud and clear, selling her like surplus stock. The road stretched ahead, winding toward the jagged silhouette of the mountains. Somewhere up there was whatever life Elias Crow had in mind for her. Whether it was salvation or just another form of captivity, she couldn't yet tell. But she knew one thing: this was a turning point. Her old life had ended on that wagon bed in the market square. Whatever came next would be forged in the cold shadow of those peaks. The market had been left behind for miles, but Hannah could still hear it, the snickers, the whispers, the snap of her father's voice as he bartered her away. The wagon rolled steadily, the rhythmic clop of hooves almost hypnotic, yet her mind snagged on a phrase she'd caught just before Elias led her out of the square. 2 women had been standing near the produce stall, heads bent close. One of them had murmured, "After what happened back then, I'm not surprised he'd do this." The other's reply had been lost in the shuffle of boots and voices, but Hannah could still see the look in her eyes, pity mixed with something else. Knowledge. She frowned, replaying the words. What happened back then? Her father had done plenty over the years, driven off relatives, swindled neighbours, but there'd been nothing she knew of that could explain a public sale of his own daughter. Unless there was more she didn't know. Beside her, Elias kept his gaze fixed on the road. He sat straight-backed, his hands steady on the reins, his silence as solid as the mountains ahead. He hadn't asked her anything, not why she was there, not what she could do, not even if she wanted to come. It was as though he was merely fulfilling a transaction, nothing more. The blanket he'd given her lay across her lap, its coarse wool scratching against her palms. She wasn't cold yet, but she pulled it around her shoulders anyway, if only for the sense of being shielded from the open air. The bread rested in her lap, untouched. Hunger gnawed at her, but pride kept her from tearing into it in front of him. After a long stretch of silence, Elias spoke. "We'll make camp before sundown. Roads get tricky after dark." His voice was low, measured. Not unkind, but without the softness of someone offering comfort. She nodded, unsure if he expected a reply. They passed through rolling hills, the dry grass whispering in the breeze. Occasionally, a lone farmhouse or a weathered fence line would appear, only to vanish again as the road curved. The further they went, the fewer signs of people there were. At one point, Elias pulled the horses to a slower pace and glanced toward the tree line on their left. "Elk tracks," he murmured, almost to himself. Hannah followed his gaze but saw nothing. He clicked his tongue and the wagon moved on. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in streaks of gold and crimson. It was then that the mountains came fully into view. Jagged peaks, rising like the spine of some ancient creature, their upper slopes still dusted with snow. Hannah's breath caught. They were beautiful, yes, but there was something about their sheer scale, their unyielding presence, that sent a shiver through her. "That's where we're headed," Elias said, noticing her stare. His tone held no pride, no invitation, just fact. "They look unforgiving," she admitted. A faint twitch passed over his mouth, gone before she could read it. "They are, but they don't lie." The road narrowed as they climbed, the wagon wheels creaking in protest against the incline. Shadows stretched long across the trail, and the air grew sharper, cooler. Hannah pulled the blanket tighter. The bread finally gave way to her hunger. She tore off a piece and chewed slowly, the dense crust cracking between her teeth. She thought again of the market, of the women's words. The incident they'd referred to lingered in her mind like a splinter. If Elias knew anything about it, he wasn't offering. As twilight deepened, they reached a small plateau where the trail widened just enough for the wagon to rest. Elias set the brake, climbed down, and began unhitching the horses. He moved with quiet efficiency, every gesture practiced. Hannah stayed on the seat, uncertain if she should help or stay out of the way. He gathered wood, struck flint, and coaxed a fire into life. The flames threw light onto his face, revealing lines etched deep around his eyes, not all from age. Without a word, he gestured toward the warmth. Hannah descended stiffly, settling on a fallen log near the fire. The heat seeped into her bones, easing muscles knotted from tension. Elias ladled water from a canteen into a small pot and set it over the flames. "Tea," he said simply, then returned to tending the horses. She watched him work, her mind a tangle of questions, about the women's whispers, about why he'd bought her at all, about what waited for her in those mountains. When he finally returned, handing her a tin cup steaming with bitter-scented brew, the last light of day was fading behind the peaks. The firelight flickered across his features, casting them in shifting shadow. The mountains loomed above them now, their slopes dark against the star-pricked sky. Hannah felt their presence like a weight on her chest, half promise, half warning. She sipped the tea, its heat chasing away the chill, and realized with a start that whatever awaited her beyond those peaks would change her life forever. Whether for better or worse, she couldn't yet tell. By the time the wagon crested the final rise, dawn had broken and the world was awash in pale gold. The air was thinner here, touched with the scent of pine and cold stone. Hannah shifted under the blanket, trying to shake off the stiffness in her legs, as Elias guided the horses down a narrow track toward a small clearing. The cabin appeared almost suddenly, tucked against the hillside, as though it had grown there with the trees. Smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney. A clear stream ran nearby, its steady gurgle carrying on the crisp morning air. A chicken coop stood to one side, and beyond it a goat pen. The garden lay dormant under the touch of early frost, its furrows neat and waiting. Elias stopped the wagon and climbed down without ceremony. "This is home," he said simply. Hannah stepped down, her boots crunching against frost-hardened ground. The cabin was smaller than she'd expected, its weathered logs dark with age, but there was a sturdiness to it that spoke of careful upkeep. He pushed open the door and gestured for her to enter. The interior was modest, a single room with a stone fireplace dominating one wall, a sturdy table, and 2 chairs. Shelves lined with jars and tin containers. A ladder led to a loft above. "Kitchen's here," Elias said, motioning toward the hearth and shelves. "Loft's yours, my room's through there." He pointed to the only closed door. She waited for the rest, for the list of chores, the unspoken expectations, but it didn't come. Instead, he leaned against the table, arms folded. "You're not here to serve me," he said, his tone even. "You're here to rest, find your footing. Whatever happened back there, You need time to get clear of it. Hannah blinked, caught off guard. That's it? That's it, he replied, turning to stoke the fire. It felt wrong to simply sit idle. The idea of relying on anyone, even temporarily, put her on edge. So later that morning, when Elias went out to tend the animals, she followed. The goats were wary at first, their eyes bright and curious. Elias showed her how to scatter feed, how to check their water trough, how to coax them close without spooking them. They know if you're tense, he said, scratching one behind the ears. Best to move slow. She mimicked his movements, awkward but willing. By the third goat, she earned a tentative nudge from a velvety nose. Next came the chicken coop. The hens clucked and shuffled as Elias opened the gate. Eggs are under the straw. Watch your hands. They peck if they're feeling possessive. Hannah crouched, sliding her fingers beneath warm, feathered bodies. The eggs were smooth and brown, fragile yet firm. She placed them gently in the basket he'd given her, an unexpected sense of accomplishment stirring in her chest. When the morning work was done, they carried the eggs back inside. Elias set a pot of water to boil while Hannah rinsed the dirt from her hands. The fire popped and hissed, the scent of wood smoke mingling with the faint aroma of pine that clung to her clothes. It was peaceful. That, more than anything, unsettled her. After breakfast, Elias left her to her own devices. She wandered the edge of the garden, noting the tidy rows and the tools stored neatly under an overhang. The soil here was dark and rich, unlike the dry, stubborn earth of Dry Creek. She imagined kneeling in it, planting seeds, watching something grow. The thought felt both foreign and oddly comforting. By midday, a light wind had picked up, rustling through the trees. Hannah found herself standing at the stream, watching the water twist and sparkle over smooth stones. She knelt, cupped her hands, and drank. The cold shocked her mouth, but it was clean, pure. Nothing like the tepid well water she'd grown up with. When she returned, Elias was splitting wood by the shed. His movements were steady, deliberate, the axe rising and falling with the rhythm of long practice. He didn't look up as she approached. "I want to help," she said, surprising herself. He paused, resting the axe head on the block. "You don't have to." "I know, but I want to." A small nod, and he stepped aside to show her the proper stance. Her first swing was clumsy, the log barely dented, but Elias didn't laugh. "Let the weight of the axe do the work," he instructed. They worked until the light began to fade. That night, Hannah climbed to the loft, her muscles pleasantly sore. She lay under the quilts, listening to the stream outside and the steady crackle of the fire below. For the first time in a long while, she felt the edge of something she'd thought lost forever, safety. The days began to take on a rhythm. Morning chores with the goats and chickens, quiet afternoons in the garden or by the stream, evenings spent by the fire. Hannah moved through them with a cautious ease, still wary of Elias's reticence, but no longer expecting some hidden demand to surface. It was during one of her morning tidying sprees in the loft that she found it. She had been sweeping dust from the far corner, pushing aside an old wool blanket to reach the floorboards beneath, when the bristles caught on something solid. Curious, she pulled the blanket back and revealed a trunk. It was made of dark wood, the grain rich and deep, with brass fittings dulled by age. A heavy iron lock secured the lid. But what drew her attention wasn't the craftsmanship, it was the carving on the top. Interwoven vines and flowers, curling into a pattern that felt strangely familiar. Her gaze dropped to her own wrist, to the faint outline of a tattoo she'd almost forgotten about. She'd gotten it in her 20s, or so she'd believed, though the memory of the day was hazy. The pattern on the trunk was almost identical, her breath hitched. She reached out, running her fingertips over the grooves in the wood, tracing the same curves inked into her skin. The sensation was unsettling, as if the trunk were a puzzle piece she hadn't known was missing. The loft ladder creaked suddenly, and she jerked her hand back. Elias's head appeared, his expression unreadable. "Everything all right?" "Just cleaning," she said quickly, nudging the blanket back over the trunk. He nodded once and disappeared down the ladder, but she could feel his awareness, like he knew exactly what she'd found and was choosing not to address it. That afternoon, the sound of hooves approached from the trail. Elias stepped onto the porch, and Hannah followed to see a small, sturdy mule coming to a halt in the clearing. Its rider was a woman in her 50s, her hair streaked with grey, her posture straight and certain. "Maeve," Elias greeted her. "Didn't expect me so soon," the woman said, dismounting. She carried a leather satchel that clinked faintly when she moved. "Had a free morning, thought I'd bring you that willow bark tincture." Her gaze shifted to Hannah, and something softened in her eyes. "And you must be the new arrival." Hannah managed a polite nod. "Hannah Cain." Maeve smiled faintly, but didn't comment. She and Elias spoke quietly for a few minutes, their voices too low for Hannah to catch more than a word here or there. Supplies, snowmelt, fences. Then Maeve turned back to her, looking her over with a frankness that felt almost like assessment. "You settling in?" Maeve asked. "I suppose so," Hannah replied, unsure how much to reveal. Maeve's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good. You should know Elias isn't much for conversation, but he's steady. Keeps his word." "I've noticed." The older woman adjusted her satchel, then leaned in slightly, her voice dropping just enough to make Hannah lean closer. "He's also a man who's lost someone important, someone who has more to do with you than you realise." Hannah blinked, taken aback. "What do you mean?" But Maeve was already stepping back, her tone brisk again. "Well, I'd better be on my way before the clouds build up. Snow's coming sooner than folks expect this year." Elias saw her off, the two exchanging a few final words before she rode away down the trail. Hannah remained on the porch, the chill in the air sinking into her bones. Maeve's words echoed in her mind, unsettling in their implication. Someone important. More to do with you than you realise. She thought of the trunk in the loft, the carving on its lid, the way Elias's eyes had flicked toward it before saying nothing. When Elias returned to the porch, she caught his gaze, but he only said, "We should bring in more wood before dark." It was a practical suggestion, yet it felt like a diversion. Hannah followed him toward the woodpile, her mind turning over the pieces she'd stumbled upon. A lock, a carving, a tattoo, and a stranger's cryptic warning. None of it made sense yet, but she could feel the threads tightening. And somewhere in her gut, she knew. Whatever lay inside that trunk was bound to her in ways she couldn't yet name. The morning broke cold and clear, the kind of mountain air that felt sharp enough to cut. Hannah had risen early, drawn by the quiet that seemed to hum in the space between dawn and full daylight. She was on her way to check the chicken coop when a sharp, distressed cry split the stillness. It came again, a harsh, piercing sound from beyond the garden. She followed it, boots crunching over frost-hardened ground until she reached the edge of the clearing. There, half hidden among the scrub, was a red-tailed hawk. Its wings flailed weakly against the tangle of old fence wire it had managed to trap itself in. The bird's amber eyes locked on hers, fierce despite the tremor in its body. "Easy now," Hannah murmured, crouching. She inched closer, careful not to startle it. The hawk hissed, beak snapping the air, but its movements lacked real strength. She pulled her shawl free and draped it gently over the bird, dimming its sight. "Shh, it's all right." The fabric settled over its back, and the flailing slowed. Hannah slid her hands beneath the bundle, feeling the rapid thud of its heart through the cloth. By the time she reached the cabin, Elias was stepping out of the shed, axe in hand. His eyes narrowed when he saw what she carried. "What have you got there?" "A hawk. It's hurt, caught in wire." Her voice came out breathless from the hurry. He set the axe aside and strode forward. "Bring it in." Inside, he cleared the table with swift efficiency, pushing aside a basket of eggs and a few tools. "Lay it here." Hannah set the bundle down gently. Elias drew back the shawl, revealing the hawk's wing twisted at an unnatural angle. "Not broken," he said after a quick examination. Just strained. Feathers are scraped, maybe a cut or two. We can fix that." The "we" startled her almost as much as his calm. He moved to a cabinet and pulled out a small tin of salve, strips of clean cloth and a shallow bowl. "Hold it steady," he instructed. She cupped her hands around the bird's body, feeling its muscles tense under her touch. Elias's fingers worked with surprising gentleness, cleaning the wounds with warm water, smoothing salve into the raw spots, then binding the wing close to its body to keep it still. When they finished, the hawk lay quiet, its breathing steady. Hannah brushed her fingertips over its head, marvelling at the sleekness of the feathers. "We'll keep it here for now," Elias said, already fashioning a small enclosure near the hearth from a wooden crate. "Somewhere warm, safe, see how it fares." Hannah helped him line the bottom with straw. They set the bird inside, covering part of the crate to give it shade. For a long moment, they both just watched it, the silence between them softer than usual. Hannah realized she was seeing something new in Elias, not the gruff mountain recluse who'd bought her, but a man who understood how to handle fragile things without breaking them. "Thank you," she said quietly. His gaze flicked to hers, then away. "You found it. Just doing what needed doing." Still, there was something in his voice, an undercurrent of approval that warmed her more than the fire. The rest of the day unfolded around the hawk's presence. Hannah checked on it every hour, offering bits of meat and fresh water. By evening, it was more alert, watching her with those sharp eyes that seemed to measure her worth. After supper, she sat by the crate, sketching the curve of its beak in the small notebook she'd brought from Dry Creek. Elias passed behind her once, pausing briefly to glance at the page. "Good likeness," he murmured, before retreating to his chair by the fire. It wasn't much, but it was the first unprompted praise he'd given her. Hannah found herself smiling, the expression foreign on her face after so many months of bitterness. When she finally climbed to the loft that night, the hawk's quiet rustle below was oddly comforting. She lay in the dark, the memory of Elias's steady hands lingering in her mind, along with the realization that maybe, just maybe, there was more to him than she had let herself believe. The hawk's recovery became a quiet anchor in Hannah's days. Each morning, she'd change the straw in the crate, check the bandages, and offer slivers of meat. By the end of the first week, the bird's eyes were brighter, and it shifted restlessly, testing the limits of the injured wing. One cold afternoon, Elias told her they were running low on certain herbs for the salve. "Maeve has what we need," he said. "She's due to bring supplies tomorrow." The next day, the crunch of hooves announced Maeve's arrival. Hannah was in the loft, sorting through a small box of odds and ends she'd found, when she heard their voices below. At first, it was the usual talk: weather, fence repairs, and the coming winter. Then Maeve's tone changed. "You've heard the talk in town?" "I've heard," Elias replied, his voice low. "Robert Cain's been telling anyone who'll listen that you're keeping her here against her will, spinning tales about improper conduct." Maeve's words were laced with disgust. Hannah's stomach clenched. "Let him talk," Elias said flatly. "Those who matter know the truth." "Some will believe him," Maeve warned. "And you know why, because of what happened back then, because of the traitor in the Cain family." Hannah leaned forward, straining to hear. Elias's reply came after a long pause. "That's not a story I'm telling her, not yet." "You can't protect her from it forever," Maeve pressed. "It's her history as much as yours." The sound of Elias moving ended the conversation. Hannah scrambled back to the far side of the loft just before his boots creaked on the ladder. He didn't look up at her as he set a bundle of herbs on the table. "You'll want to grind these fresh," he said, as if nothing unusual had been said outside. That night, unable to hold back her questions, Hannah caught him while he was refilling the Hawk's water dish. "Maeve said something about a traitor in my family. What did she mean?" His hand stilled for a fraction of a second before he resumed. "It's not a story for tonight." "Then when?" she pushed. "When you're ready to hear it," he said, his tone final. Frustration prickled at her, but something in his expression told her she wouldn't get more by pressing now. Later, as they sat by the fire, Elias began to talk, not about the Cain family, but about himself. He spoke of the war years, of being stationed far from the mountains, of the raids that left towns in ashes. He told her about Sarah, his wife, and Joseph, their boy, both lost in an attack he hadn't been there to stop. "I came back to these mountains because they were the only place that hadn't changed beyond recognition," he was. "Xenon Batifili." "The only place that didn't remind me of what I'd lost." Hannah listened, the weight of his words pressing against her chest. She could see the grief etched into the lines around his eyes, hear it in the careful way he spoke their names. When he fell silent, she wanted to ask the question that had been burning since the day she arrived. Why had he bought her? But something held her back. He'd given her pieces of himself tonight, more than she'd expected, and prying for more felt wrong. Instead, she reached for her sketchbook and began to draw the hawk, perched on the edge of its crate, eyes alert. Elias watched her for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Somewhere beyond the cabin, gossip and lies were spreading like wildfire. But here, in the circle of firelight, there was a fragile truce. Two people carrying burdens neither was ready to fully share, bound together by the simple act of keeping a wounded creature alive. And for now, that was enough. The snow line had crept lower on the mountains by the time Elias mentioned the gathering. They were stacking the last of the split wood when he said, "There's a celebration coming up in the valley where the river bends east. Running Wolf invited us." Hannah straightened from where she'd been piling logs. "A celebration?" "A harvest gathering," Elias explained. "Music, food, trade, not just for their people. Outsiders are welcome if they come with respect." It wasn't lost on her that he said their people, not our. Still, the thought of leaving the cabin for somewhere filled with voices and laughter stirred a strange mix of anticipation and unease. "Why me?" "Because you've been cooped up here for weeks," he said simply, then added, and because you should meet them. They set out early the next morning, riding the 2 horses Elias kept in the back pasture. The trail wound through stands of aspen, their leaves gone now, white trunks gleaming in the weak sunlight. Frost sparkled on the grass, crunching under hoofbeats. By midday, the sound of distant drums reached her ears, low, steady, like the heartbeat of the earth. As they descended into the valley, the scene unfolded, a circle of lodges around a wide open space, smoke curling from cook fires, children darting between clusters of brightly dressed women. The scent of roasting meat drifted on the air, mingling with wood smoke and something sweet, berries perhaps. People turned to look as they rode in, their expressions curious but not unfriendly. A tall man with silver streaks in his braids stepped forward, his face breaking into a wide smile. "Brother," he greeted Elias warmly, clasping his arm. "Running Wolf," Elias said, and there was a rare note of warmth in his voice. The 2 men spoke briefly in a language Hannah didn't recognize before Running Wolf turned to her. His dark eyes studied her for a moment, not unkindly. "You are welcome here," he said in careful English. "Come, there is food and stories to be heard." Hannah found herself drawn into the rhythm of the gathering. A woman handed her a wooden bowl of stew, rich with vegetables and venison. Children laughed as they played games with carved sticks and painted stones. Drums and singing rose and fell in the background, blending into the flow of conversation and movement. After the meal, a group of elders sat near one of the fires, their voices weaving tales in their own tongue, while a younger woman translated for the guests. Hannah listened to stories of the mountains, of rivers that carried memory, of stars that marked the passing of seasons. When the last story ended, Running Wolf approached her again. In his hand was a small piece of leather, dyed deep red, with a design burned into it, a flame cradled in 2 cupped hands. "You have spirit," he said, tying the leather to a cord and placing it gently around her neck. "We call you Little Flame." The name startled her. "Little Flame?" "You carry heat," he said with a faint smile, "even in cold places." For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. The weight of the pendant was light, but it seemed to settle into her chest like an ember catching. Later, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, Elias and Running Wolf sat together by the largest fire. Hannah lingered nearby, listening to their conversation. "You stayed away too long," Running Wolf told him. "Had my reasons," Elias replied. "You always do." There was no malice in the words, only a kind of resigned fondness. "But I am glad you came. The mountains are quieter when you walk them." The drums started again, faster now, and dancers stepped into the open space. Men and women moving in patterns older than the cabins and towns below. Hannah watched, the firelight painting their faces, the rhythm thrumming through the ground beneath her boots. For the first time since Dry Creek, she felt something untainted by fear or suspicion, a sense of belonging, even if it was borrowed for an evening. When they left the valley under the light of a rising moon, the pendant rested warm against her collarbone, and the name Little Flame echoed in her mind. She wasn't sure she deserved it yet, but maybe, just maybe, she could grow into it. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the packed earth. Most of the dancers had drifted away, their laughter and chatter fading toward the lodges. Hannah lingered near the edge of the circle, tracing the small flame pendant at her throat. Running Wolf motioned for her to join him by a quieter fire at the far end of the camp. Elias was already there, seated cross-legged, his posture more relaxed than she'd ever seen. The chief's eyes held the weight of someone deciding whether to speak a truth or keep it buried. Finally, he looked at Elias. "It is time." Elias's jaw tightened. "She's not ready." "She is stronger than you think," Running Wolf replied. Then to Hannah, "Do you know who Elias's wife was?" Hannah shook her head slowly. She'd heard only the barest hints, enough to know there had been loss, but not enough to give it a name. "Her name was Mara," Running Wolf said. "She was the younger sister of your mother." The words hit like a sudden drop in the trail, unexpected, jarring. "My aunt?" Elias's gaze met hers for the first time that night. There was no denial there, only a weary acceptance. "Yes," Running Wolf continued, his voice steady. "Before you were born, there was a promise between families. If anything happened to your parents, Elias would take you in. It was agreed and sealed with respect." Hannah felt the world tilt slightly. "Then why?" "Because Robert Cain broke it," Elias cut in, his tone clipped. "He decided there was more money in keeping you under his thumb. Said it was about family pride, but it was greed, pure and simple." The fire popped, sending a spark into the dark. Hannah barely noticed. Pieces of her life shifted in her mind, rearranging themselves into something she didn't quite recognize. The cold distance of her father, the unexplained bitterness whenever her mother's family was mentioned, it all took on a different hue. Running Wolf leaned back, his gaze flicking between them. "Elias has carried that promise in silence for years. You were not forgotten, only stolen." Elias's hands rested loosely on his knees, but there was tension in his shoulders. "I should have come for you sooner." "I didn't. That's on me." Hannah's throat felt tight. "Why tell me now?" "Because lies rot the ground they're planted in," Running Wolf said, "and because what's coming will test you both." She swallowed hard, trying to anchor herself. "What's coming?" The chief didn't answer directly. Instead, he added wood to the fire, the flames rising between them. "This is only the beginning, little flame. The mountain tests those it means to keep." It should have been the climax of the night. A shocking family connection revealed, the truth of old betrayals laid bare. But Hannah sensed in the way both men sat, in the heaviness that settled after the words, that this wasn't an ending. It was an opening. Later, as they prepared to leave, Elias walked beside her in the cool night air. "I wanted you to have this time," he said quietly, "before more storms hit." She looked at him sharply. "You mean that figuratively, or both?" he said, and nothing more. The moon rode high as they left the valley, the sound of drums fading behind them. Hannah gripped the reins of her horse a little tighter, the pendant warm against her skin, her mind turning over the revelation again and again. Elias wasn't just the man who'd taken her from her father. He was family, by blood and by promise. And the man who should have been her guardian had been turned into a stranger by Robert Cain's will. But if this was only the beginning, she couldn't imagine what the rest of the story would bring. The first snow had begun to cling stubbornly to the shaded corners of the clearing when Hannah heard the sound of horses. Too many for a simple visit. She was gathering kindling near the goat pen, the cold biting at her cheeks, when the crunch of hooves and the creak of leather harnesses grew louder. Elias emerged from the shed, wiping his hands on a rag. His posture stiffened instantly. Two riders broke through the tree line. The first was Robert Cain, his frame as rigid as the day he'd sold her, a self-satisfied glint in his eye. Beside him rode Sheriff Cole, a man whose badge was as tarnished as his reputation, known for taking bribes and turning a blind eye when it suited him. Behind them, 2 more men followed, rifles slung casually but eyes sharp. Robert swung down from his horse with the flourish of a man arriving to collect a debt. "There she is," he said loudly, as if Hannah were a stray animal finally cornered. "Living in sin with a hermit in the hills." "Robert," Elias greeted flatly, his voice a low warning. "Save it," Robert snapped. "I've got the law on my side this time." He gestured to the sheriff. Sheriff Cole dismounted slowly, pulling a folded piece of paper from his coat. "Elias Crow, you're under arrest for unlawful detention and moral corruption of this woman." His tone carried the smug confidence of someone who believed the outcome was already decided. "That's a lie," Hannah said sharply, stepping forward. "I'm here because I choose to be..." "Quiet, girl," Robert barked, his eyes narrowing. "You don't know what's good for you. I'm taking you home where you belong." Elias moved instinctively, stepping between them. "She's not going anywhere with you." The sheriff raised a hand in mock caution. "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be." He pulled a pair of iron cuffs from his belt. "Turn around, Crow." Elias didn't move. His eyes met Hannah's, calm but steady, a silent message passing between them. Then, with deliberate slowness, he turned and extended his wrists. The click of the cuffs was louder than it should have been. Robert's grin widened. "Smart man. Now, Hannah." One of the armed men dismounted and stepped toward her. His grip on her arm was firm, his voice dripping false politeness. "Let's go, ma'am," Hannah jerked back. "I'm not going with you." Robert's face hardened. "You don't have a choice." Sheriff Cole shoved Elias toward his horse, securing the chain of the cuffs to his saddle. "You'll come quietly, or you'll make me drag you," he warned. Elias kept his balance, his voice calm but cutting. "This won't hold, you know it." "Maybe," the sheriff replied with a shrug, "but it'll hold long enough." The armed man pulled Hannah toward Robert's horse. Her heels dug into the frozen ground, but his grip was unyielding. She glanced over her shoulder, catching Elias's gaze one last time before Robert stepped into her line of sight. "You think this mountain man's your saviour?" he sneered. "He's nothing but trouble. I'm the only family you have." The words were meant to sting, but Hannah felt only a cold clarity. "Family doesn't sell you to the highest bidder," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Robert's mouth twitched, the veneer of control slipping. "We'll see what you're saying in a week's time." Within minutes, they were moving. Elias forced to ride ahead under guard, Hannah pulled onto the back of Robert's horse. The cabin, her small corner of safety, grew smaller and smaller behind them, until the trees swallowed it from view. The path down the mountain was steep and icy in places. The wind cut through her coat, but the greater chill came from the realization that she was being dragged back into the life she had fought to leave. Somewhere behind her, a hawk's cry echoed against the peaks. Hannah turned her head slightly, enough to glimpse Elias's profile. Even in chains, he sat straight, his expression unreadable, but she recognized the glint in his eyes. It wasn't defeat, it was resolve. The ride down the mountain was slow, the trail made treacherous by patches of ice, hidden under loose snow. Hannah's hands were numb from the cold, but her mind was a storm of its own. She kept glancing at Elias, cuffed and silent, the metal chain clinking with each sway of his horse. Her fingers brushed the inside pocket of her coat for warmth and stopped. There was something there, something small and metallic, pressing against the fabric. She slipped her hand in and felt the cool shape of a key. Recognition struck instantly. the heavy iron key she'd seen on Elias's desk, the one that matched the lock on the carved trunk in the loft. She closed her fist around it, her pulse quickening. He must have slipped it into her coat before Robert and the sheriff had arrived. Why, trust, a message, whatever it meant, it was clear he'd intended her to have it, and that meant its contents were important. The thought gave her something solid to cling to as they descended into the lower valley, but that fragile thread of hope frayed when the group reached the cabin. Robert dismounted and gestured to the armed men. "Search it, top to bottom." They went in without hesitation. Hannah twisted in the saddle to watch as drawers were yanked open, shelves rifled through. The sound of boots on the loft ladder made her stomach clench. Minutes later, one of the men emerged, holding a small leather folder. "Found this under the mattress in the back room." Robert snatched it, flipping it open. His smile was cold. "Well, now, look at this. Property deeds, permits, all in Crow's name. Won't be needing these anymore." Elias's voice cut through the winter air. "Those are legal documents. They prove my right to the land." "Not anymore," Robert said, tucking the folder into his coat. "Now they're just scraps of paper I'll be happy to lose." The men finished their search, leaving the cabin in disarray. Hannah's chest tightened at the sight of it. Chairs knocked over, the contents of cupboards spilled across the floor. But through the mess, she kept her face still, the weight of the key in her pocket reminding her she held something Robert didn't know about. The journey resumed, the cold biting harder as the trail widened into the road toward town. Elias rode ahead under the sheriff's watchful eye, Robert's horse close behind. Hannah leaned forward slightly, speaking low enough for only Robert to hear. "Stealing documents doesn't make the truth disappear." He gave a short laugh. "Truth's whatever people believe, and in town they'll believe me." She turned her gaze to the distant mountains, swallowing her anger. She thought of the trunk's carvings matching her tattoo, of the conversation she'd overheard between Elias and Maeve. There was more here, more than Robert could control with lies. They reached Dry Creek just as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the snow pink and gold. Instead of taking Elias straight to the sheriff's office, Robert ordered the men to stable the horses and lock him in the back room of the saloon. "Less paperwork," Sheriff Cole said with a shrug. As Robert herded her toward his own wagon, Hannah caught Elias's eye through the narrow gap of the saloon's side door. No words passed between them, but the look was enough. Hold on. That night, in the cramped guest room of Robert's house, Hannah lay awake, the key hidden under her pillow. She thought about the trunk and what might be inside. Proof of ownership? Letters? Something that could unravel Robert's lies? And then she remembered Running Wolf's words at the festival. The mountain tests those it means to keep. The celebration had been full of trade, gifts exchanged between hands. What if something had been given there, something not in the cabin at all? The idea sparked like flint. If the trunk held one piece of the puzzle, maybe the other piece waited back in that valley, a place Robert would never think to look. For the first time since they'd been taken, Hannah felt the stirrings of a plan. The courthouse in Dry Creek was a squat, square building of weathered brick, its front steps dusted with a thin layer of snow. By the time Hannah was escorted inside, the gallery benches were nearly full. Merchants, ranch hands, townsfolk she recognised from years past, all drawn by the promise of scandal. Elias stood at the front, his wrists free now, but his posture guarded. Sheriff Cole loitered by the door like a man confident his side would win, while Robert sat ramrod straight at the prosecutor's table, his jaw tight and his eyes brimming with triumph. Judge Harrison entered, his black robe sweeping the floor as he took his seat. "This court will now hear the matter of the people versus Elias Crow," he intoned. "Charges include unlawful detention and moral misconduct." The prosecutor launched into his opening, painting Elias as a dangerous recluse who had lured and confined Hannah against her will. Hannah's hands clenched in her lap at each twisting of the truth. When it was the defence's turn, Elias's lawyer, a wiry man named Denton, rose calmly. "Your Honour, the defence contends that not only were these charges fabricated, but the plaintiff, Robert Cain, has a history of exploiting and abusing his own daughter for personal gain. We intend to prove that Mr. Crow acted only as a protector." Robert snorted loudly, drawing a warning glance from the judge. The first witnesses were locals who'd seen the public sail in the marketplace. Tom Wheeler from the general store took the stand, hat in hand. "I saw it with my own eyes. Robert Cain offered her in trade for a rifle and 3 sacks of flour, called her too much dead weight for ranch work." Gasps rippled through the room. Robert's lawyer objected, but Judge Harrison overruled him. Next came Sarah Linton, who ran the boarding house. "I remember feeling sick to my stomach," she said. "It wasn't a joke. He meant it." Denton allowed the words to settle before calling the next witness, Running Wolf. The room shifted at his presence, the tall figure striding forward with the quiet authority of someone unshaken by the eyes on him. He placed a weathered leather satchel on the evidence table and withdrew a folded parchment, edges worn soft. "This is a copy of the treaty and property records recognised by territorial law," he said. "It affirms Elias Crow's legal right to his land and his protection of those who seek shelter there." The judge examined the document, eyebrows lifting slightly. "And this was in your possession?" "Yes," Running Wolf replied. "Given to me by Mara Cain, Hannah's aunt, before her death. She asked me to safeguard it should Elias ever need it." The revelation drew a low murmur from the crowd. Hannah felt her breath hitch. Here it was, proof Robert couldn't dismiss so easily. The prosecutor tried to discredit the document, but Denton was ready. "Your Honour, we also submit these as exhibits," he said, producing photographs of the original treaty stored in the territorial archives. "They match exactly." Robert shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Harrison leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Mr. Cain, do you dispute the authenticity of these records?" Robert's mouth opened, then closed. This has nothing to do with..." "It has everything to do with your credibility," the judge interrupted sharply, "and with your authority, or lack thereof, over your daughter." The defence rested its case on the combined weight of the witnesses and the legal documents. After a brief recess, Judge Harrison returned with his verdict. "This court finds the charges against Elias Crow to be without merit," he declared. "Furthermore, the evidence presented demonstrates a pattern of abuse and exploitation on the part of Robert Cain. Effective immediately, Mr. Cain is stripped of any legal claim over his daughter Hannah Cain." The gavel struck once, the sound echoing through the stunned silence before the gallery erupted, some in outrage, others in relief. Hannah exhaled, tension draining from her shoulders. Elias turned to look at her, a flicker of something warm, almost pride, crossing his face. Robert surged to his feet. "You can't." "I can," Judge Harrison cut him off. "And I have." The bailiff stepped forward, not to arrest Robert, but to usher him out before his temper could spark further disruption. Outside, the sky had darkened ominously. Wind whipped down the street, scattering loose snow into stinging flurries. Denton clapped Elias on the shoulder, murmuring something about paperwork, but Elias's eyes were on the horizon. "Storm's coming," he said quietly to Hannah. She glanced up at the roiling clouds. "Another fight?" "Not the kind you think," he replied, "but it might be just as dangerous." The wind howled louder, rattling the windows of the courthouse. People began hurrying toward home, collars turned up against the sudden cold. Hannah and Elias stepped into the street, their breath visible in the air. For a moment the victory felt fragile, as if the weather itself was warning them that the trial was only one battle in a larger war. By the time they reached the hitching post, the first flakes were falling, big, heavy, and fast. The storm was no longer a distant threat. It was here. Snow hammered the streets of Dry Creek with a sudden blinding fury. By the time Hannah and Elias reached the edge of town, drifts were already building against doorways, and the wind roared between the buildings like a living thing. A man burst from the mercantile, nearly colliding with them. His face was pale, his voice ragged from shouting over the storm. "Wagon parties stuck up near Miller's Crossing. 3 kids and their ma with them. Horses spooked, ran off. They'll freeze if no one gets to them." Hannah didn't think. She acted. "Where's Miller's Crossing?" "North Trail, 2 miles, the man said. "But you'll never make it in this weather." Elias looked at her, reading the determination in her face. "You're not going alone?" Within minutes, they'd found a handful of volunteers willing to brave the storm. 2 ranch hands, a shop boy barely out of his teens, and Mrs. Hale, who knew the northern woods better than anyone. Robert stood nearby, collar turned up against the wind, watching the hurried preparations. "You're wasting your time," he called. "It's suicide out there." "They won't survive the night without help," Hannah shot back. Robert's shrug was a blade. "Not my problem." The words hung in the icy air, sharp as the sleet that stung their faces. Hannah saw the flicker of disgust in Elias's eyes, but he didn't reply. There wasn't time. They set out on horseback, the snow swallowing the road within minutes. Visibility dropped to a few feet. The wind clawed at them, howling in their ears. Hannah rode at the front beside Mrs. Hale, following the faint indentations of wagon tracks, until even those vanished beneath the fresh powder. Her fingers burned, then went numb around the reins. She thought of the children, small bodies curled against the cold, breath growing shallow. The image spurred her forward. An hour felt like 3 before Mrs. Hale raised a hand. "There! T'chu, chanti, chi!" she shouted over the wind. Through the swirling white, a dark shape emerged, a tipped wagon half buried in snow, its canvas torn and flapping. A woman huddled inside with 3 children pressed to her sides, their faces chalk pale. Hannah was off her horse before it fully stopped, wading through knee-deep drifts. "We're here," she called. "You're going to be all right." The mother's eyes filled with tears. "Horses bolted when the wind picked up. We couldn't—" "Save your strength," Elias said gently, crouching to lift the smallest child into his arms. The others followed suit, wrapping the children in spare blankets, checking for frostbite. Hannah gave her coat to the mother without hesitation, ignoring the bite of cold against her own skin. Getting back was harder. The storm had only grown worse, the wind a relentless wall. They moved in a tight line, riders shielding the rescued from the worst of the blast. Hannah kept glancing over her shoulder, counting heads, refusing to let the snow steal anyone from her sight. At last, the lights of Dry Creek flickered through the whiteout. People poured from the saloon and store to help carry the children inside, wrapping them in quilts, pressing mugs of steaming broth into their hands. Robert was there too, standing in the lee of the livery stable. His expression was unreadable until one of the ranch hands muttered, "Could have been you out there, Cain. Might have made folks think better of you." Robert's lip curled, but he said nothing, turning away as if the sight of gratitude and relief offended him. Inside the mercantile, Hannah sat on a bench, thawing her frozen hands by the stove. Elias was beside her, his face ruddy from the cold, but his eyes warm. "You did well," he said quietly. "We all did," she replied, glancing around at the volunteers. But inside, a small part of her felt a fierce pride. She hadn't just survived today. She'd led. Outside, the storm still raged, but in here, the air was thick with the sound of life, of people safe because they'd refused to leave anyone behind. And in Robert's retreating back, Hannah saw the truth everyone else was beginning to see. When it mattered most, he chose himself. The storm had finally broken, leaving the mountains wrapped in a heavy, white stillness. For 2 days, Hannah and Elias stayed in town, helping with the aftermath, repairing fences, delivering supplies to families whose stores had been ruined by the snow. But when the roads cleared enough to ride, they turned their horses toward the mountains. The air was sharp and clean, the kind that filled the lungs with a bracing chill. Snow clung to every branch, turning the forest into a cathedral of white and silver. Their horses moved carefully along the trail, hooves muffled by the deep drifts. It was late afternoon when the cabin came into view, its roof heavy with snow, smoke curling gently from the chimney. Hannah felt a swell of relief at the sight. This place had become more than shelter. It was the one place in the world that felt like hers. But as they dismounted, she noticed the stillness. No rustle from the chicken coop, no gentle bleat from the goat pen, and from the porch there was no sharp, watchful cry from the hawk. Her steps quickened. The crate where the bird had been recovering sat open, the straw inside undisturbed but cold. Elias followed her gaze and shook his head slightly. "We knew it might happen," he said quietly. Hannah knelt beside the crate, fingertips brushing the edge. She had checked on the hawk that morning before the trial, feeding it, noting how it had tested its wing. But the storm must have been too much, the cold seeping in despite their care. Elias disappeared into the shed and returned with a small spade. "We'll bury it near the garden," he said. They worked in silence, the snow giving way reluctantly under the steel of the spade. When the hole was ready, Elias lifted the hawk from its crate, its body wrapped in a piece of soft cloth. He placed it gently in the earth, and Hannah knelt to scatter a handful of dried wildflowers over it. For a long moment they stood side by side, the wind whispering through the pines. "It was never really mine to keep," she said softly. Elias glanced at her, his expression unreadable, but his voice steady. "None of us are. We just look out for each other while we can." She met his gaze, understanding in her chest like a steady flame. "That's what you've done for me." He was silent for a beat. Then, without ceremony, he said, "Family's not always about blood. Sometimes it's about who stays." The words sank into her, warming something long cold. She nodded, the lump in her throat too thick for speech. After they'd filled the grave and smoothed the snow back over it, they went inside. The fire in the hearth had burned low, so Hannah knelt to feed it, coaxing the flames higher. The cabin's familiar scents, wood smoke, dried herbs, the faint tang of leather, wrapped around her like a quilt. Elias hung their coats by the door, then settled into his chair. "We've both had our share of storms," he said, "and I reckon there'll be more. But you're here now. That matters." Hannah took the seat opposite him, leaning back, letting the heat from the fire soak into her bones. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. Outside, the snow began to fall again, softer this time, a quiet curtain drifting through the trees. Hannah imagined the hawk's spirit riding the wind above the mountains, free of the injuries that had kept it grounded. She thought of the way it had fought to recover, the way it had tolerated her careful touch. In some ways, its journey mirrored her own, wounded, wary, but slowly finding strength again. When Elias rose to refill their mugs with coffee, she watched him move about the cabin with the ease of someone rooted in his place. And she realized that, without meaning to, she had grown roots here too. As night settled, they sat together in companionable silence, the fire painting the walls in gold and shadow. Hannah turned the small flame pendant between her fingers, feeling its smooth edges. It had been given to her as a name, but it had become a reminder that even in cold places, warmth could be kept alive. For years she had been defined by what her father had taken from her: freedom, dignity, safety. Now she was beginning to see herself in terms of what she had built and who she had chosen to stand beside her. The hawk's grave would be covered by snow come morning, but she knew where it was and what it meant. A marker of care given freely, of trust earned, of a bond formed not by obligation, but by choice. When she finally climbed to the loft, the cabin below still glowed with firelight, and Elias's quiet movements continued as he banked the embers for the night. Hannah paused at the top of the ladder, looking down. "Good night, Elias," she said. He looked up, a faint smile at the corners of his mouth. "Good night, Hannah." And in that moment she knew, whatever storms lay ahead, they would face them as family. 2 weeks after the storm, the mountains softened under a steady melt. Icicles dripped from the eaves, the garden soil darkened with promise, and the air held the faint scent of pine sap and thawing earth. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that Hannah decided to unlock the trunk. The key Elias had slipped into her coat felt heavy in her palm. She climbed to the loft, pulled back the old wool blanket, and fit the key into the lock. It turned with a reluctant click, the sound echoing in the stillness. Inside lay neatly stacked bundles, letters tied with ribbon, a folded quilt, and at the very bottom a worn, leather-bound journal. Hannah lifted it carefully, her hands tingling as if she were holding something alive. The first page bore her mother's name in looping script. She sat on the edge of the loft, light from the small window falling across the yellowed paper. The entries began in her mother's youth, full of ordinary joys and small sorrows, until the tone shifted. One passage caught Hannah's breath. "Robert has been meeting with the land agents behind Mara's back. I overheard him say the Crow homestead would be his, one way or another. Mara worries he might do something reckless, but I cannot imagine. Still, the way he watches the ridgeline, it chills me." Further in, her mother's handwriting trembled across the page. "The fire took Mara tonight. Elias was away hunting. Robert says it was an accident, but I know the smell of lamp oil when I walk into a room. He told me to forget for Hannah's sake. I write this so the truth will not die with me." Hannah's grip on the journal tightened. The air in the loft felt thinner, her pulse loud in her ears. The betrayal was deeper than she'd known, not just against her, but against Elias, and against the woman who had been her mother's sister. She descended the ladder, journal in hand. Elias was at the table, mending a harness strap. He looked up, his eyes scanning her face. "You opened it," he said quietly. "Yes," she replied, "and I know." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Elias set the strap aside. "I suspected for years, but suspicion without proof is just a shadow. Now," he gestured to the journal, "you have proof." Hannah sat across from him, the weight of the words settling between them. "We could take it to the law." "We could," he said, "but the law won't bring her back. What matters now is what we do with the truth." The fire popped in the hearth, sending up a small flare of sparks. Hannah thought of the children in town, of the way they'd huddled in the mercantile during the storm, hungry for warmth and safety. She thought of the way isolation in these mountains could harden or heal, depending on who you had beside you. "I want to make this place into something more," she said slowly. "A school. A place where mountain kids, Ute, settlers, anyone, can come to learn, no matter where they come from." Elias's brow lifted slightly, but there was approval in his eyes. "It would suit you, and it would honour her." They began making plans almost immediately. Word spread quickly. By the first thaw, families were offering to help build benches, donate books, and clear land for a play yard. Hannah also began to write. At night, by lamplight, she filled pages with her story. Not just the betrayal and the trial, but the quieter truths, the hawk's recovery, the gift of a name, the way a cabin in the mountains had become a home. She wrote about choosing family, about the power of keeping promises, even when the world tried to break them. Spring came fully in May. The garden flourished with green shoots, the stream ran fast and clear, and the school's first lessons began under the budding aspens. Hannah stood on the porch, watching children chase each other in the yard, their laughter ringing out into the bright air. Elias joined her, leaning on the railing. "Looks like you built something worth keeping," he said. She smiled, the sunlight warm on her face. "We built it." Beyond the clearing, the mountains rose, no longer looming, but standing like quiet sentinels. The shadows they cast were shorter now, and the light between them golden. Hannah closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sounds and sense of spring settle into her bones. For the first time in years, her story felt whole. Not because the pain was gone, but because it had been given a place alongside the joy. The flame at her throat glinted in the sunlight, steady and bright.